The suffocating scent of burning iron and fresh blood filled my lungs as the cold blade of the guillotine finally descended upon my neck. I sat up abruptly in bed, my hands flying to my throat, to check for a wound that was no longer there. Instead of rough executioner ropes, my fingers brushed against smooth, soft skin and the delicate lace of a child's nightgown. I looked down at my hands and realized they were tiny, uncalloused, and completely free of the battle scars I had earned over a decade of war. I scrambled out of the massive bed, my short legs tangling in the heavy sheets as I desperately sought a mirror. Staring back at me from the polished glass was an 8-year-old girl with bright blonde hair and wide, innocent sea blue eyes. This was the face I had possessed before the thirst for power transformed me into a monster feared by the entire continent. Memories of my past timeline flooded my mind, vivid and agonizingly real, refusing to be dismissed as a mere nightmare. In that past life, I had allowed envy and the cold neglect of my father to poison my very soul. I remembered how my father, Emperor Cassian, had always looked right through me as if I were a ghost unworthy of his attention. All of his pride, his guidance, and his affection had been showered exclusively on my older brother Raymond. Driven by a desperate need for validation, I had plunged the empire into a brutal civil war to seize the crown. I had personally orchestrated the betrayal that led to Raymond's demise, watching the light leave his eyes without an ounce of pity. But the throne I bought with my brother's blood brought nothing but isolation, paranoia, and ultimate ruin. The very nobles who had flattered my cruelty eventually turned on me, leading to my public execution on that rainy night. A heavy shudder rippled through my small frame as I swore a solemn vow never to repeat those horrific mistakes. If the timeline had truly reset, it meant that Raymond was still alive, healthy, and entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. The thought of facing the brother I had murdered made my heart race with a paralyzing sense of guilt. To protect Raymond and ensure my own survival, I knew I had to completely alter my behavior from this moment forward. I could no longer show any ambition, any talent, or anything that could ever make me a rival to the crown prince. I would become a shadow, an ordinary and forgettable princess who desired nothing more than a quiet, inconspicuous life. A gentle knock on the heavy oak door broke the silence of the room, causing me to jump in alarm. I quickly softened my posture, adopting the demeanor of a fragile, easily frightened young child before speaking. "Come in," I called out, intentionally pitching my voice higher to match the vocal cords of my 8-year-old self. The door swung open to reveal Clara, my childhood maid, carrying a freshly pressed pastel dress over her arm. Seeing Clara alive and young filled me with a sudden surge of warmth, as she had also been a casualty of my reckless ambition. "Good morning, Your Highness. It is time to prepare for your breakfast with the Crown Prince," Clara announced cheerfully. The mention of breakfast with Raymond sent a sudden icy jolt of adrenaline straight through my veins. Forcing down the panic, I offered a small, compliant nod and allowed Clara to guide me toward the dressing screen. As the layers of the frilly pink dress were fastened tightly around my torso, I felt as though I were putting on a deceptive disguise. Every step down the long, echoing imperial corridor toward the dining hall felt like a march toward my own judgment day. The heavy double doors of the private dining room loomed ahead, guarded by 2 stoic knights in gleaming silver armor. As the guards pushed the doors open, my eyes immediately locked onto the young boy sitting at the long mahogany table. It was Raymond, completely uninjured, radiating the gentle nobility that I had once despised so intensely. A massive wave of emotion rose in my throat, threatening to break through my carefully constructed mask of innocence. "Dorothea, you're finally awake. Come sit next to me and try these fresh strawberries," Raymond called out warmly. I forced my trembling legs forward, offering him a shy, slightly clumsy smile as I took my seat. Looking at his bright, trusting face, the memory of his cold, lifeless body from my past life flashed vividly before my eyes. I quickly looked down at my plate, terrified that he would see the dark, sinful secrets swirling within my soul. I will act weak, I will act foolish, and I will let him shine as the sole bright sun of this empire, so that he may live. Just as a fragile sense of calm began to settle over me, the heavy doors at the end of the hall burst open once more. A cold, suffocating pressure flooded the room as a tall, imposing figure stepped through the threshold, his piercing eyes locking onto us. Emperor Cassian stood like an immovable monument of dark ivory against the grand arched doorway. His long black cloak seemed to swallow the flickering golden light of a nearby candelabra. My tiny 8-year-old hands began to tremble violently beneath the heavy silk bedsheets. This was the man who had abandoned me to the isolation of the secondary palace in my previous life. His crimson eyes held no paternal warmth, reflecting only the cold calculations of absolute power. I forced myself to lower my gaze, carefully hiding the burning embers of my past memories. To survive under his reign, I had to convince him that I was entirely devoid of ambition. Cassian took 3 deliberate steps forward, his polished leather boots clicking sharply against the marble. Every rhythmic strike of his footwear felt like a countdown to my own execution. He stopped at the foot of the bed, looking down at me as if inspecting a flawed piece of property. "Greetings, Father, Emperor of the great Ibra Empire," I whispered in the most fragile voice I could muster. He did not answer immediately, letting a suffocating silence fill the grand space between us. I could hear the faint rustle of the wind outside against the heavy glass windows of the tower. "The royal physicians state that your sudden fever has broken, Dorothea," he spoke, his voice a low baritone rumble. "Yes, Father, the fever has left me completely whole," I replied while nodding submissively. He narrow-mindedly scrutinized my small frame, looking for any trace of the standard Milan royal spirit. In my previous life, I would have glared back with fierce defiance to demand his affection. But that prideful anger was the precise catalyst that ultimately led me to the executioner's block. "A weak child who collapses from a mere chill is of little use to this empire," he stated flatly. Those words of harsh dismissal were exactly the music I needed to hear tonight. "I apologize for my fragile state and for causing you any unnecessary worry, Father," I murmured softly. Cassian paused, his sharp gaze lingering on my face to detect any hidden deceit. The air in the room grew heavy, as if a violent thunderstorm was about to break. I maintained my facade flawlessly, keeping my expression as blank and harmless as a porcelain doll. With a soft, dismissive grunt, the Emperor finally turned his full gaze away from my presence. "Do not neglect your basic studies, even if you are lacking in true imperial talent," he ordered. "I will do exactly as you command, Your Imperial Majesty," I replied with an obedient bow. The heavy oak doors shut with a resounding thud that echoed deeply through the empty chamber. I immediately collapsed backward onto the soft pillows, my lungs desperately gasping for air. I had successfully passed the very first obstacle on this treacherous path to survival. If the Emperor deemed me worthless, he would never view me as a threat to the succession. That meant my beloved older brother, Raymond, would remain completely safe from my future wrath. I needed to map out a strategy to maintain this weak persona for the next 10 years. I walked over to the massive window looking out over the sparkling capital city of the Empire. The beautiful streets below would one day burn if I failed to alter the timeline correctly. The primary danger lay in the upcoming imperial evaluations where every child's spiritual power is tested. In my past life, my overwhelming spiritual aura was what first drew the Emperor's calculating attention. I had to find a method to seal my own inner magic before anyone else discovered its existence. Running my tiny fingers over the dusty volumes, I searched desperately for information on binding rituals. Suddenly, a soft, deliberate knock on the outer door shattered the heavy midnight silence. A voice from behind the heavy wood called out, carrying a familiar warmth that made my heart freeze. A voice from behind the heavy wood called out, carrying a familiar warmth that made my heart freeze. My breath caught in my throat as the door slowly creaked open to reveal my older brother, Crown Prince Raymond. Seeing his radiant blonde hair and pure sea blue eyes instantly brought back the horrific image of his blood spilling across the cold throne room floor. I squeezed my small hands into tight fists beneath the mahogany table to stop them from shaking uncontrollably. Raymond stepped forward with a kind, effortless grace that befitted the perfect future ruler of the Ibra Empire. He spoke softly, noting that he had noticed how isolated and quiet I had been since my sudden recovery from the fever. My mind immediately flashed to the past timeline, where his gentle concern was always met with my bitter, resentful silence. He placed the elegant velvet box onto the polished wooden desk, pushing it gently toward my trembling form. He explained that he had commissioned a special gift from the imperial artisan to celebrate my health and to cheer me up. I stared at the box as if it were a dangerous, living creature capable of striking me down at any moment. Slowly, with fingers that refused to obey my mind, I reached out and pulled the smooth silver ribbon loose. As the lid lifted, the afternoon sun caught the gleam of a magnificent silver dagger nestled in dark silk. The sharp reflection of the blade sent a violent jolt of pure panic straight through my small chest. In an instant, the grand library vanished, replaced by the memory of a dark, rain-slicked balcony where I once held a very similar weapon. I could feel the ghostly sensation of warm, sticky blood coating my palms as I remembered plunging that blade into his heart. The phantom sound of Raymond's dying gasp echoed so loudly in my ears that I wanted to scream aloud. Raymond, entirely unaware of the psychological torture he had just unleashed, smiled and began to explain the weapon's purpose. He told me that the rose carving on the hilt symbolized the protection of the imperial family, meant to keep me safe. He stated that as a princess of the Ibra Empire, I should always possess a means to defend myself when he was not by my side. The irony was a cruel, suffocating weight. The very weapon he gave me for protection was the instrument of his future demise. I couldn't touch it, terrified that if my fingers brushed the silver hilt, the dark urge of the tyrant would awaken once more. Raymond noticed my pale face and sudden withdrawal, his cheerful smile faltering into an expression of deep concern. He asked me in a soft, hurried voice if I disliked the gift or if the blade frightened me. I needed to maintain my facade of a weak, ordinary child, but the overwhelming trauma was clouding my ability to think clearly. I forced my voice to tremble intentionally, trying to blend my genuine terror into the act of a fragile, timid young princess. I whispered that weapons were far too scary for someone as weak and clumsy as me. Raymond sighed softly, a mixture of amusement and profound tenderness, softening his regal features. He reached out and gently patted the top of my blonde head, his touch radiating a protective warmth I didn't deserve. His kindness felt like a searing iron against my soul, a constant reminder of the monster I used to be. He promised that if the weapon frightened me, he would keep it safe for now and act as my ultimate shield instead. As he picked up the box, the oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted slightly, allowing me to take a full breath. He bade me farewell with another gentle smile, turning on his heel to leave the library so I could rest in peace. I watched his retreating back, swearing to the heavens that I would protect his life, even if it meant destroying my own future. But the respite was terrifyingly short-lived as the heavy library doors suddenly flew open again with a loud, echoey crash. A high-ranking Imperial herald stood at the threshold, gasping for air with a look of sheer urgency stamped across his face. He announced that Emperor Cassian had suddenly summoned Princess Dorothea to the Grand Imperial Court, effective immediately. My heart plummeted into a bottomless pit of despair. A sudden summons from my cold father never boded well for anyone. The herald added that the Grand Imperial debut was being moved forward, and all royal children were required to display their lineage. A cold sweat broke out across my neck as I realized the terrifying implication of this sudden, unprecedented event. At the grand debut, my hidden, monstrous spiritual powers would be completely exposed to the entire empire, forcing a deadly confrontation with the ruthless emperor himself. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom creaked open, revealing the dazzling expanse of the imperial court. Hundreds of aristocrats turned their sharp, calculating gazes directly toward my fragile childhood form. Every step across the polished marble floor felt like walking toward an executioner's block. At the far end of the hall sat Emperor Cassian, his crimson eyes gleaming with cold, unyielding judgment. Next to him stood Raymond, who offered me a warm, reassuring smile that only deepened my inner guilt. The high priest stepped forward, holding the ancient glass orb used to measure imperial spiritual aptitude. I desperately tried to suppress the chaotic swirl of energy boiling deep within my soul. In my past life, this very moment had marked the awakening of my destructive, monstrous capabilities. The high priest commanded me to place my trembling hands upon the cold surface of the artifact. The very instant my fingertips brushed the glass, a violent crack echoed through the silent hall. A blinding torrent of dark violet and gold spiritual energy erupted from the shattered orb. The immense pressure shattered the stained glass windows, sending colorful shards raining down like deadly confetti. Nobles screamed in terror, scrambling backward away from the unprecedented display of raw power. Emperor Cassian stood up from his throne, his powerful aura flaring to combat the sudden threat. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as the monstrous power threatened to consume my mind entirely. The Emperor descended the marble steps slowly, each footprint leaving a scorched mark on the carpet. To think such a monstrous force was hiding within a supposedly weak child, he muttered coldly. The entire room fell into a deathly silence, waiting to see if the monarch would execute his own daughter. Cassian drew his gleaming blade, pointing the sharp tip directly at my throat. prove your worth to the Ibra Empire right now, or be erased as a dangerous anomaly," he demanded. My mind raced as the memories of my previous execution flashed vividly before my eyes. Suddenly, a stray construct of uncontrolled spiritual energy manifested into a sharp beast, lunging directly toward Raymond. Raymond froze in shock, completely unable to defend himself against the incoming magical anomaly. "Not again," I screamed internally, refusing to let my brother die by my power a second time. I forced my chaotic energy to shift, molding the destructive force into a protective shield instead. A magnificent barrier of solid golden light materialized instantly in front of my older brother. The dark, spectral beast crashed violently against the golden wall and shattered into harmless sparkles. I controlled the remaining ambient magic, gently dispersing the heavy storm until peace returned to the room. Emperor Cassian slowly lowered his sword, his crimson eyes widening slightly in genuine surprise. He realized that my power was not a tool of mindless destruction, but a force capable of absolute control. "You possess the power to destroy, yet you chose to protect," the Emperor stated, his voice echoing softly. Raymond ran out from behind the fading shield, throwing his arms around me in a desperate, tight embrace. "Thank you for saving me, Dorothea," he whispered, his voice trembling with deep emotion. Tears finally spilled from my own eyes as the heavy chains of my past regrets began to shatter. Emperor Cassian turned back to the court, declaring that Princess Dorothea would be granted full autonomy within the palace. I had successfully rewritten the stars, turning a potential tragedy into a triumphant victory for our family. No longer would I be haunted by the bloody ghost of the tyrant I used to be. My beloved brother Raymond would live, and I would protect his path to the throne from the shadows. The Ibra Empire was safe, and my second chance at life had finally found its true purpose. I smiled into the warm morning breeze, knowing with absolute certainty that this time our story would end in eternal peace.